Edward Tyson, a physician in 17th century London, witnessed a world where madness was perceived as a bestial essence, and Bedlam was not a hospital but a dungeon. He achieved the impossible. He removed chains from patients and applied a therapy rooted in compassion and observation. He left behind work capable of revolutionizing medicine, becoming a visionary whose ideas predated his era by 2 centuries. Yet his humanism was consigned to oblivion, and his insights were rejected. Tragically, one of his patients, a great poet, never left Bedlam alive. We often perceive scientific discoveries as sudden flashes of insight, triumphs of genius that instantly transform the world. However, the history of science is far more complex. It is a succession of missed opportunities, rejected truths, and forgotten names. Progress does not ignite in a sudden blaze. It laboriously pushes through layers of resistance, ignorance, and deliberate oblivion. Behind every breakthrough lies not just victory, but also bitter tragedy, the tragedy of those who paved the way but never witnessed its continuation. In a world where insights were extinguished and progress was shackled by the chains of dogma, suffering was the norm. The 17th century knew no mercy, only harsh laws reinforced by belief in divine providence and ancient treatises. Medicine, far from being a science, was based on archaic beliefs about the four bodily humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Any ailment was attributed to their imbalance. Treatments included bleeding patients to the point of fainting, administering emetics that purged the intestines to exhaustion, and cauterizing wounds with red-hot iron or boiling oil to burn out the disease. Pus on a wound was considered laudable, a sign that the illness was exiting the body. Yet the most terrifying condition was madness. It was not considered an illness, but rather a demonic possession or a bestial essence that robbed individuals of their reason and soul. The mentally ill received no treatment. They were confined in prisons, chained to walls, starved, and subjected to cold. They were beaten to drive out the demons. They lived and died in Bedlam, which was not a hospital but a public spectacle where onlookers paid a penny to gawk at the wild, insane. Their screams were merely part of the city's din, their suffering an everyday occurrence. It was a world where pain was a tool, and ignorance formed the foundation of knowledge. A world desperately in need of a breakthrough but fiercely rejecting any attempts to achieve it. A world where a human life was worthless if afflicted by illness. Edward Tyson was born in 1651. The son of a Bristol merchant, he received a classical education at Oxford before pursuing medical studies in London. His chosen path did not anticipate revolutions. He prepared to become a physician of his era, adhering to established rules and applying accepted methods. However, his encounter with the reality of hospitals changed everything. The young doctor observed that 17th century medicine was not a science but a ritual of pain. He watched as patients were tortured with bloodletting until they fainted, their skin seared with red-hot iron, and their insides purged to complete exhaustion. He saw suppurating wounds that were considered signs of healing and heard cries that physicians ignored, citing ancient treatises and divine providence. In the hospitals where he practiced, particularly the infamous Bedlam, Tyson confronted the most horrific manifestation of this cruel order: the treatment of those deprived of their sanity. They were kept in chains, starved, and beaten to drive out demons. Their bodies were covered in ulcers, and their eyes reflected a desperate madness. No one saw them as suffering human beings. They were regarded as animals, as possessed monsters. Tyson was different. He viewed them through a different lens, seeing not beasts, but human beings crippled by illness, not by a curse. His medical training taught one thing, but his conscience and sharp intellect urged him toward another. He began to question every postulate, every treatment, and every accepted norm. He could not reconcile himself with this reality, this world where pain was a tool and ignorance the foundation of knowledge. He could no longer observe such agony in silence. Tyson could not remain silent. His conscience demanded action, and his keen mind sought proof. He began with what seemed unthinkable within Bedlam's walls. He removed the chains. Not from everyone at once, but starting with those most emaciated, whose limbs were ulcerated to the bone by the metal. The faces of other doctors and wardens twisted with horror and in disdain. They whispered of indulging the devil, of the doctor's own madness. But Tyson saw something else. He witnessed the agony receding, and for the first time in a long while, a spark of meaning, a glimmer of humanity, appeared in the eyes of some patients. He observed, and he meticulously recorded every detail. His notes became his secret weapon. Day and night, he spent among those whom society had rejected and condemned. He studied their reactions to light and darkness, to sounds and silence. He noted that screams intensified with every touch of a rod, while silence descended when someone simply sat nearby without attempting to inflict pain. He discovered that hunger and cold did not exorcise demons, but rather plunged the mind into an impenetrable darkness, turning people into the animals they were expected to be. He sought patterns where others saw only chaos, thereby confirming his hypothesis. Madness was a disease, not a curse. One day, in the dead of a harsh London winter, something unforeseen occurred. The oil ran out. Not just lamp oil, which provided meager light in the gloomy wards, but also the medicinal oil, the thick, foul-smelling substance used to smear patients' bodies, believed by ancient custom to expel illness through the skin. This barbaric ritual was a mandatory part of their treatment, causing only new ulcers and suffering. Without it, other physicians believed the disease would rage even more fiercely, necessitating even crueler measures. The wardens awaited orders, expecting Tyson, like everyone else, to resort to sticks and whips to calm the agitated. But Tyson did something different. His decision was radical. He did not seek a replacement for the oil, nor did he resort to force. He approached one of the most restless patients, a young man who was banging his head against the stone wall, his body covered in suppurating sores, his eyes burning with despair. Tyson sat beside him on the cold floor and began to speak calmly, monotonously. His voice was the only sound in the ward, apart from the man's ragged breathing and dull thuds. He spoke of the weather, the trees outside the window, the quiet of the night, and the distant shores of Bristol, where he was born. He made no attempt to reason with him. He simply was there. He simply saw a human being. Minutes stretched into hours. The young man did not react immediately, but gradually the rhythm of his banging slowed. His breathing became steadier. His body ceased to tense, as if invisible bonds had loosened. Finally, he fell silent. There were no screams, no pain, no habitual senseless thrashing, only silence. And a gaze, for the first time in many months, directed at Tyson without the veil of madness. This method had no name. It was not described in treatises. It contradicted everything he had been taught. But it worked. It was the first step toward a medicine based not on superstition, but on observation, not on torture, but on humanity. Tyson saw the result. He saw hope, and he understood. This was just the beginning of a path no one was ready to accept. Tyson understood that one case was not enough. He needed proof. He met the doubts of physicians and the contempt of wardens with cold persistence. He did not argue. He observed. The wards of Bedlam became his laboratory, and those whom society had written off became his subjects. He began keeping detailed diaries, recording not only changes in patients' conditions, but also the minutest details of their environment. When light fell on them, when complete darkness descended, which sounds calmed them, and which provoked new fits of rage. He studied the influence of food, air temperature, and even smells on their behavior. This was empiricism in its purest form, long before the term became widely accepted in medicine. He noticed that aggressive outbursts often preceded periods of complete exhaustion, that hunger did not exorcise demons, but merely intensified delirium, and that cold did not harden the spirit, but caused fever and apathy. He saw that where others beat and restrained, he placed patients before a window, allowing them to watch passers-by, trees, and clouds. And he observed how convulsions subsided, how their gaze became clearer, how a semblance of human appearance returned. These were not miracles. They were the results of a systematic, methodical approach. He learned from every interaction. If one intervention worsened a condition, he immediately abandoned it, seeking an alternative. He was not afraid of mistakes, but learned from them. Thus, a new technology of treatment was born, without bloodletting, without cauterization, without torture. It consisted of observation, creating a comfortable environment, regular nutrition, clean clothing, and simple yet persistent attempts at communication. Tyson did not invent complex apparatuses. His tools were patience, attention, and a deep conviction in the humanity of every being, even the most unfortunate. He introduced fresh air walks, which were considered unthinkable, for the possessed. He ensured patients were given sedatives not for subjugation, but to restore sleep disrupted by nightmares and pain. He himself devised and recorded short phrases that he repeated to his patients to return their sense of reality and restore their connection to the world. All his discoveries and observations he meticulously documented. He wrote not in Latin, the language of scholars and the elite, but in his native English. He wanted his ideas to be accessible not only to a narrow circle of medics, but to any educated person. He believed that only the widespread dissemination of knowledge could change the world. His works were not mere reports, they were appeals to compassion, supported by irrefutable facts. He demonstrated that madness was not a condemnation, not a sign of the devil, but an illness amenable to study and therefore to treatment. He paved the way to understanding that a mind shackled by disease could be freed not by force, but by knowledge and mercy. Tyson's path, paved by compassion, immediately met fierce resistance. A single, albeit stunning case could not instantly break centuries. Old foundations. Physician colleagues who had for decades practiced bloodletting to the point of fainting and cauterization with red-hot iron, looked upon Tyson with undisguised contempt. They labeled his methods dangerous, heretical, and indulgent of the devil, accusing him of questioning the immutable tenets of their craft and undermining the authority of centuries of accumulated knowledge. For them, madness remained either divine punishment or possession, and any display of humanity toward the demon possessed was seen as weakness and a threat. The wardens, accustomed to the rod and chains as their sole instruments of control, grumbled. They saw Tyson not merely as an eccentric, but as someone disrupting the established order. Their world, built on fear and suppression, was crumbling. They complained about him to the hospital's board of governors, demanding his dismissal, stating that the doctor himself had gone mad for allowing animals to move freely and even converse with them. Their arguments were simple. Without pain, there was no control. Without control, there was no order. Tyson was a threat to everything they knew and believed. However, not everyone at Bedlam was willing to reject the obvious. Tyson found defenders among the hospital's board of governors, London merchants, and officials. They were pragmatists. Ancient treatises or theological disputes held no sway for them. Results were what mattered. And Tyson was delivering results, sometimes unbelievable ones. Patients under his care died less frequently. Their bodies were cleaner, their ulcers healed. They did not destroy hospital property or require constant forceful subjugation. This translated to lower maintenance costs, fewer complaints, and most importantly, an improved reputation for Bedlam. Tyson wasn't just healing, he was saving money and face. It was these figures, rather than blind faith in his humanism, that compelled the governors to protect the doctor from the attacks of his colleagues and wardens. They gave him time and space to continue his miracle. This unstated alliance, founded on pragmatism, was fragile, but it allowed Tyson to continue his experiment, his repatch evaluation of humanity, in a world where it was a commodity, not a right. Pressure on Bedlam's board of governors intensified. Whispers escalated into open accusations. Conservative physicians, whose methods Tyson silently disproved with every healing, demanded immediate retribution. Wardens, stripped of their accustomed authority over patients, complained of chaos and indulging madness. Finally, a day was set for a major inquiry, not merely an internal council, but a hearing involving representatives from the Royal College of Physicians, England's highest medical authority. The objective was clear. Either Tyson would be dismissed, or his methods would receive official recognition. In the spacious yet cold hall gathered medical luminaries, board members, officials, and influential London merchants. The atmosphere was tense. On one side stood centuries of dogma, reinforced by the authority of ancient treatises and fear of the unknown. On the other, a single man armed only with observation and compassion. Tyson did not argue or deliver grand speeches about humanism. Instead, he laid out his diaries on the table. Dozens of handwritten pages, a testament to hundreds of days and nights spent among the outcasts. He spoke of facts, presenting figures. A 3-fold reduction in mortality, a 2/3 decrease in aggressive outbursts, and reduced costs for restraint and repairs. He did not merely read dry reports, he told stories. Stories of patients whose bodies had been ravaged by ulcers and whose eyes were vacant, but who could now sit by a window, recognize their relatives, and utter their first coherent words. He described how silence and warmth replaced screams and cold, how simple food and clean clothing restored people's dignity. His opponents tried to interrupt him, citing Aristotle and Galen, divine punishment, and demonic possession. They demanded proofs that in their world could only be bloodletting or cauterization. But Tyson answered them not with theory, but with living examples. He even brought several patients whose conditions had significantly improved as witnesses, a sight unimaginable for Bedlam. These individuals were not cured in the full sense, but they were living refutations of all dogmas. They were people, not beasts. The members of the Royal College, accustomed to academic debates, were astonished. The pragmatic merchants on the Board of Governors saw not only saved lives, but also saved funds. They envisioned Bedlam's future, not as a shameful stain on London, but as an institution capable of genuine healing. After long deliberations, a decision was rendered. It marked a turning point. Dr. Tyson's methods were not only deemed permissible but also recommended for wider dissemination. He was granted full authority to implement his principles of treatment at Bedlam, and his observations and writings were recognized as the foundation for a new medical practice. From an outcast considered mad, Edward Tyson transformed into a recognized innovator, whose ideas, even against the will of the old world, began to pave the way for a new era in the understanding of the human mind. His victory was not just a personal triumph. It was a victory of common sense over superstition and of mercy over cruelty. From that day forward, Bedlam began to change, not in an instant, but step by step. Dr. Tyson received not only official permission but also the necessary resources to implement his principles. His methods, which had been considered heretical just yesterday, became the new protocol. First, the chains disappeared from the wards. The metal shackles that had bound the bodies of the unfortunate for centuries were removed permanently. In their place came clean sheets, warm clothing, and regular nutritious meals. Patients were no longer starved or beaten. Instead, Tyson introduced daily walks in a small inner courtyard. Fresh air and sunlight, things unimaginable for the possessed, became part of the routine. He insisted on hygiene, regular baths and changes of linen. Suppurating ulcers, once considered the exit of the ailment, were now treated and healed, not ignored. Most importantly, the attitude changed. Screams and thrashing were no longer suppressed by force. Tyson and his few supporters among the staff, those who dared to defy centuries of inertia, learned to speak with patience. A calm tone, simple phrases, repeating names. These seemingly insignificant details constituted a true revolution. If a patient couldn't sleep, they were given a mild sedative, not to subdue them, but to allow their exhausted mind to rest. If they were in a fit, they were not restrained but rather distracted, soothed by voice, and made to feel safe. Some wardens initially resisted, but seeing the tangible changes and approval from above, they were compelled to comply. The results were immediate. The statistics Tyson had so scrupulously collected and presented spoke for themselves. Mortality among Bedlam patients decreased by nearly threefold in the first year after the new protocols were implemented. The number of aggressive incidents requiring physical restraint dropped by 2/3. These were not just figures. They represented saved lives and the restoration of human dignity. Bedlam, once a symbol of shame and inhumanity, began to acquire a different reputation. Visitors, accustomed to the sight of beaten, dirty madmen, now saw people who, though ill, were well, cared for, calm, and sometimes even capable of coherent dialogue. Some patients, considered hopeless for years, began to show signs of improvement. Though isolated cases, they existed. A few individuals previously chained to walls were able to return to their families and integrate back into society. This was a breakthrough no one dared predict. The economic benefits were also evident. Fewer deaths meant lower funeral costs. Less destruction meant savings on building repairs. Less need for a large staff of wardens employing force reduced personnel expenses. Bedlam, in essence, became a more efficient and less costly institution. Tyson's ideas, documented in his diaries and presented to the Royal College of Physicians, began to spread. First, within Bedlam itself, becoming part of the mandatory training for new staff. Then, beyond its walls. The Royal College of Physicians, having recognized his methods, began to include them in their recommendations for other asylums. What had been one man's bold experiment became the foundation for a new medical paradigm in psychiatry. For the first time in many centuries, madness ceased to be a curse, a sign of the devil, or a bestial essence. It became an illness, and it could be treated, not with chains, not with whips, but with attention, compassion, and a scientific approach based on observation. This was the first, yet decisive, step toward what would later be called humane psychiatry, a step taken in the 17th century, 2 centuries before the world was truly ready to accept it. However, Edward Tyson's victory at Bedlam, though stunning and pragmatic, did not immediately become a beacon for the entire world. His revolutionary ideas, meticulously documented in his detailed diaries, proved too bold for their time. The established norms, the resistance of ignorance, and the inertia of centuries, old perceptions of madness, all proved stronger than the facts and the lives he saved. Tyson's name, his discoveries, and his unique approach to human suffering were largely forgotten for almost 2 centuries. Humane psychiatry, which had its nascent beginnings in the 17th century, had to await true recognition until the 19th. This is the paradox of progress. It does not erupt in triumph, but rather pushes through layers of oblivion, leaving behind not only victories, but also tragedies. The tragedies of those who, like the great poet, never saw freedom, even though the path to it had already been laid. Edward Tyson paved that path, yet the world failed to see it. And in this lies the main lesson of his